Okay, so picking up on lesson 4 now. So we talked about how Chicago won the right to host the 1892 World's Fair, and it was largely because Chicago basically ponied up more money. But let's look at some of the reasons why people were a little surprised, even maybe Chicagoans, that the city decided to put itself out there. First thing, Chicago's modern nickname is the Windy City, a name that comes actually from all of the political negotiations and stuff that goes on. It has nothing to do with actual like air. Um, just an aside, Milwaukee actually produces more wind and higher wind gusts than Chicago does. Um, but in the 1890s, Chicago's nickname was not the Windy City, which, by the way, is a name that came from the negotiations for the World's Fair. Chicago's nickname was the Black City, and that's because it was disgusting. The roads were unpaved, and when it rained, they turned to seas of mud. Additionally, they were full of dead bodies, both animal and human, raw sewage, and garbage. The city was immense, remember. It had absorbed 10 communities around it to make itself the second largest city in America. They had not updated the waste facilities to accommodate this. So when it rained, raw sewage flowed into the streets of the city of Chicago, turning it into giant muddy poop collections. There were garbage stacks 30 feet high in Chicago city alleys that would collapse and sometimes kill people. And not only that, all the rats and everything else that lived in them. And that when it rained or something else, again, they would just like spill out into the streets. If, like a horse, got stuck in the mud trying to go through on a rainy Chicago day, they would simply shoot it and leave it in the street. If the horse turned up lame because it had a bad shoe or something, they'd shoot it and leave it in the street. And the remarkable, like, presence of occasionally dead bodies that popped up in the road. Why? We'll get to that in a second. The atmosphere was full of coal dust and smoke. Chicago's main source of cashola for its millionaires may have been the meat packing industry, but there were lots and lots of factories and processing plants everywhere. The smoke and dust was so bad from these that if you were on like the 10th floor of the skyscraper and looked down, you couldn't see below the 5th floor. You literally could not see the street below you. Clean water was hard to find. Chicago's main source of clean water was Lake Michigan and the Chicago River, both of which is where Chicago's sewage dumped into. And the river drained was supposedly that's one reason why they changed the course of the river was so that the sewage would flow out of the city. But nevertheless, it was pretty disgusting. One European reporter described Chicago as a body with the skin removed. Another one said that Chicago was an open, festering sore on the face of America. Now, all of this is bad, but it's still not the capper of all of it. Chicago was full of crime. Organized crime gangs, these were ethnic gangs, Italians, Irish, basically ran whole sections of the city. They paid off police officers and politicians. They were the like basically de facto rulers of the city of Chicago. There were still anarchists in the city of Chicago. Remember, we're only a few years removed from the Haymarket riot. There were labor problems all over the city. Again, the Haymarket riot. The police force had not grown in proportion to the size of the population. They had very little training, were very inexperienced, and were exceptionally corrupt. Chicago may have been the most corrupt police force and political city in America at this point in time. There's the issue of death. 40 people a day died in Chicago. Now, that's really not the significant number. People die all the time. It's just kind of how we are. What's significant is that one of every four of those, 10 in every 40, were homicides. That means for every four people dying in Chicago, one was murdered. The national average was for every 100,000 people who died, one was a murder. Chicago's murder rate was 25,000 times the national murder rate. That's terrifyingly high. Additionally, you have the issue of Chicago's land. Chicago itself is an Indian word that literally translates to something out like skunk water or onion water. Chicago was a swamp. It was built on sand and clay. The solid ground you would need to build buildings on was 125 feet down. This is why building the first skyscraper in Chicago was such an immense achievement. It was built on a swamp because buildings before that just kind of sank. Here's a newsflash: they still do sink, but not quite as much. But there's a specific reason for this. Now, I bring this up too about how far down you had to go for the solid rock, because if you remember when we were talking about the Brooklyn Bridge, at 40 feet under the Hudson River, that's 40 feet below sea level, divers and workers experience a condition called the bends. It's where your body over oxygenates the blood. You begin cramping severely, and your internal organs can shut down and collapse from the pressure. That's at 40 feet. This is 125 feet. That's not good. Now, for all of this, why in the world would anybody think of picking Chicago? Well, that's because Chicago actually does have a couple of things going for it. Number one, unlike New York City, which just, wanted the fair and felt they should have it because they're New York, Chicago had been planning on hosting the fair for a really long time. They were prepared. They had a fair commission set up. Their commissioners had already come up with a plan for what it was that they were going to do. So they were way ahead of the game. Chicago's Fair Commission was headed by two architects, because remember, Chicago was sort of the place for cutting edge architecture at the time. It's where the who's who of the architectural world did their things. The two leaders of Chicago's fair organization, the directors, were John W. Root and his business partner, Daniel Burnham. Now, Root and Burnham were widely known throughout the United States because they were the ones who had designed the first skyscraper. It's called the Montauk Building. Here's a picture of it. It's nothing really spectacular to look at, but what's amazing is it is 13 floors of concrete, brick, and stone built on a swamp. And notice all the other buildings around it are stone too. That is because these two architects also figured out a way to build on that swampy land. They came up with a concept called floating foundations, which I'm going to put a little video up for you. It's really kind of cool about how floating foundations work. Essentially, instead of trying to fight the idea of not having solid ground, you displace the squishiness of the water and you build a platform that kind of floats with very minimal support, allowing the building to go up. And as the building goes up, it actually settles itself down and in. They also built their headquarters, their business headquarters. It's called the Rookery. It's located downtown. I think it's on the corner of Michigan and State Street down in Chicago. This is a picture of it. It's pretty darn cool looking. It's on the National Historic Registry list. And now, what they wanted to do with the fair, because remember, fairs have themes. Their fair was going to be the city of the future, an ideal city, a utopia, a perfect city, a place where nature and human civilization coexisted in perfect harmony and balance. A combination of classical architecture, design, and stylings with futuristic, cutting edge, avant garde stylings. In order to achieve this vision of the unification of man and nature, the first person that Root and Burnham contacted to help was this man. This is Frederick Olmsted, America's premier landscape architect. He had built various and sundry city parks around the country, the most famous of which is Central Park in New York. So notice, you have a sea of green in the midst of urban sprawl. That is just one gigantic park. And this was Olmsted's creation. Now, initially, Frederick Olmsted wanted nothing to do with this because he thought it's like, I was just older and he was done building and designing stuff for cities. They made personal trips out to see him in his headquarters in Pennsylvania and gradually got him to understand that they're not talking about building Chicago a park. They're talking about building a brand new city, and that his vision for how nature and civilization would be integrated with each other and linked would form the basis of all future city design everywhere in the world. And he decided to buy into it. Now, the second part of this, and this is also exceptionally controversial, Chicago had assumed that the people of Chicago, all of Chicago's architects, would be the ones to build stuff. But that's not what Burnham and Root wanted. What they did was they contracted and contacted every major architecture firm in the country and said, "We want you to build one building for the World's Fair. Build it any way you want, any style you want, any design you want. We'll make it work." So, literally, there's just going to be a series of completely disjointed, unrelated architectural styles right in the same place. How's it going to work? Don't know, but it's going to, and we'll figure it out. Now, the evolution of the fair. So, if Chicago was unhappy that Chicago's architects weren't going to be the only ones featured on this, they're even more unhappy when they discover where the fair is going to be built. They assumed that by Chicago, it was going to be in downtown Chicago with all of its disgusting, unclean water, raw sewage, and dead bodies, and not to mention mud roads. Burnham and Root wanted nothing to do with this. They picked a park south of the downtown, one of the areas that had been absorbed by Chicago in their efforts to become the second biggest city in the country, a completely undeveloped park area known as Jackson Park. Here's Jackson Park. Yeah, you can squint way off in the background and you can see kind of some stuff way out there, but it it's just a mud pit and a bog. It really, yeah, this is where you're going to host your fair. Chicago was not happy, but that was what the directors wanted. Because they were not going to build a fair, they were literally going to build a brand new city with each architect giving his own unique style to be blended and incorporated together with a focus on art and architecture. The Chicago World's Fair, remember the Philadelphia World Expo was about land use, industry, and the centennial. The Chicago World's Fair is about Columbus with a focus on art, architecture, and culture. Now, if you remember that what we talked about in the past, like at the Philadelphia World Expo, there were food vendors and stuff there. Chicago needs to have those too, but it does not, the directors do not want them getting in the way of the actual fair itself. So instead, there's going to be four separate areas. There's going to be one area of the fair that is the actual brand new city, the World's Fair area itself, where you want to go see the displays and everything else. That's going to be where it is. There's going to be another area that is going to be the states and territories of the U.S. Then there's going to be another area that's the nations of the world. The food and fun are going to be all located on a mile-long sidewalk running out of Jackson Park, known as the Midway, because it forms the midpoint between two Chicago city parks. The Midway Plaisance, the pleasant walk, where food and fun will be available, so you don't confuse the food and the fun with the actual real fair of what they're doing. Now, there are problems from the get-go with the Chicago Fair. First of all, by the time they decided on Chicago, and by the time that things get rolling, Chicago has only a year to build it. That is not going to work. So they announced that the fair is officially pushed back a full year to 1893. It won't be celebrating Columbus's 400th. It'll be like Columbus's second trip to the U.S. that they're actually kind of commemorating. But that's okay. It'll work out somehow or another. They're really not that concerned with it. What's a bigger issue is that John Root dies unexpectedly at a very young age, too, just died. Now, this really crushed Burnham because Root was not only his business partner, he was his best friend. And he really didn't know how to handle it well. He actually was not going to, he was going to resign from the fair commission until his wife sort of talked him into it that he had an obligation to fulfill. Now, there's also a weird sort of chicken and egg problem, which is the builders, the architects cannot put the buildings up until they know how the landscaping is going to look. But Olmsted can't do the landscaping until he knows where the buildings are going to go and how they're going to look. And they keep going back and forth on this point. There's also labor issues. The need to basically build a brand new city resulted in Burnham hired everybody he could. Union, non-union, American, immigrant, didn't matter. If you were willing to work and do your job, he was willing to hire you. And he paid well, and he was really good to the workers and watched out for their safety and everything else, at least at first. This did not sit well with the unions, though, who felt that it was unfair that non-union workers were being allowed to work because it would encourage employers to hire non-union people. There were strikes threatened. Much of Burnham's time was spent up just trying to get the unions to calm down and reassure them that everything was just going to be okay. And there is the ongoing problem that there is no Eiffel Tower solution. There is nothing in Chicago that says, hey, come to Chicago and let's see this. They didn't even have the dumb bean at the time, okay? Now, there were some ideas thrown out there. One dude wanted to build the world's biggest cube. Yeah, just ponder that one. Just a big cube. Another guy wanted to build like a bizarre pyramid with like a big needle coming out of it. No, that didn't go anywhere. Gustav Eiffel offered Chicago something. He offered them another version of the Eiffel Tower, just bigger than Paris's. Chicago was excited about this and wanted it. Burnham flatly refused. He said that Chicago needed something that was uniquely Chicago and not just like a copy of Paris. Now, with all of the silliness and the chaos going on, it's probably not a good time for this to happen, but there is an outbreak of typhus in the city. Typhoid fever is a bacterial infection caused by dirty water. And the dirtiest city in Europe was London. Europe freaks out when they discover that Chicago's typhus rate is 1,800% higher than London's. And it was because largely of the disgusting water. Okay. Um, but here's where the genius of Burnham and Root really comes in. Jackson Park is not on the city's water or waste system, and they knew that specifically. They develop a system to recycle and reuse rainwater. There are giant cisterns or vats built on the top of each of the buildings. When it rains, all the water is collected and then pumped or put down into a central underground storage facility where it is then recycled through pumps into the water for the pools and fountains that will be throughout the fair. Sewage wise, they built their own sewer system that was capable of handling 6 million gallons of waste a day. And this is so cool and yet disgusting at the same time. The raw sewage, both liquid and solid, would be pumped out into a location about 20 miles outside of Chicago. It was not pumped into the river. It would then be baked in a giant oven and made into bricks, which were pulverized and put down as road bedding to make roads coming in and out of the fairground and the Chicago itself. They recycled human waste to make it a useful product. They're like really ahead of the curve on the reduce, reuse, recycle, repurpose bandwagon. The sewage system is far more efficient and modern and up to date and developed than Chicago's was. There are drinking fountains throughout the fair. Each area of the fair had its own water filtration system set up so that you could be guaranteed that the water you were drinking was purified and clean. If you still thought that was suspect, you could get fresh spring water from Waukesha, Wisconsin. Not in the form of bottles. They literally built a 120-mile pipeline from Waukesha to Chicago. They did it secretly at night, and when they got discovered, the people of Waukesha were really upset, and they had to pay a major fine for disrupting Wisconsin and stealing their water. But nevertheless, it's way ahead of its time in terms of like moving lake water from one place to another. Also, when that water came down to the fair, there was a system of underground piping that measured 50 miles long total, that had its own built-in cooling network, so that when you bought ice water at the fair, it was literally ice cold coming out of the spigots. The fair also had its own network of fire hydrants and its own fire department. And in a first, as far as innovation goes, they installed indoor fire extinguishers in the form of sprinklers in the ceilings. So, the fair is the first time that we have the innovation of sprinkler systems built into buildings. Now, the chaos and frenzy continues. So, one of the things that Burnham absolutely hated was dealing with people. That was Root's specialty. Root dealt with people. Root was the guy who sold stuff. He was the um he was the salesman and the people person. He liked meeting people. He liked doing business with them. He liked schmoozing and talking with them and just generally hanging out. That was not Burnham. Burnham was much more reserved and sort of insulated. So one of the areas that Burnham freely admitted that he had absolutely no concept of what to do was the issue of marketing. Specifically, how do you attract the attention of people to come to Chicago when nobody wanted to come here? And I mean, like, there was, the outbreak of typhus was bad enough, but you just weren't getting the people who were interested in coming here. Enter a guy named Saul Bloom, a 23-year-old Californian who had grown up in a theater family. Saul Bloom played music, sang, danced, did comedy, did a little bit of acting, a little bit of magic. But more significantly, his experience was in sales and marketing and promoting. Now, as a young man, Saul Bloom had decided to go on a trip around the world. He's only 23 at the time now. He was like 19 or 20 when he decided to do this. Took a year off and just went around the world. One of the places that he went was Paris in 1889 to the Paris Expo. And while in Paris at the Expo, he took notes on every single thing that they did and how they did it, including like observations of what he would do to make it better and what he would have done differently. He also visited the human zoo, fell in love with it, and bought himself an entire tribe of Africans. What did he do with them? And I mean, like the entire tribe, people, buildings, like plants, everything, you name it, he bought all of it. Not because he wanted them for slaves or to say that he owned them, because he just figured it'd be a good idea to have a tribe of Africans. So Bloom was introduced to Burnham through a mutual friend. And Burnham liked him, but he just thought he was too young. But not having any other choice, and the fact that Saul Bloom was pretty darn persistent, and he had his own tribe of Africans, he had a genius for marketing. So basically, Burnham just said, look, you were going to advertise, you were going to get people to come here, and I'm going to put you in charge of all the food and the fun stuff on the Midway. And this is what Bloom was so excited to do. And he came up with these beautiful color painting posters of exciting attractions on the Midway and things that were going to be going on, none of which were real, but they got people excited. And when Burnham pointed out that we don't have anything like that, Saul Bloom's answer was basically, we don't yet, but we will. And true enough, he found a way to make stuff happen. He set up displays of all the major countries in the world. And it's kind of genius the way that they did this. The Midway was divided up kind of into like different parts of the world. Um, a great example, if you can follow this is where Disney World and Disneyland got their idea for setting up like the places of the world, like Epcot. It was stolen from the Chicago World's Fair. Walt Disney's dad was one of the people who had worked on the Chicago World's Fair, and he told young Walt about his experiences, and this is where Disney got the inspiration to build Disney World and Disneyland. The fair would have all sorts of weird exotic attractions as well as amusements, food, etc. Now, there is still the problem of the Eiffel Tower. Chicago has no thing that people are going, yep, I got to go to Chicago to see this because we're not going to see it anywhere else. So, at a me pause. Sorry, we had an announcement there. So, one of the things that Burnham had to do was he's so backlogged with work and stuff to do. The last thing that he wants is to do is to have to go to a stupid meeting, but he does. He has to go to a business lunch for the American Engineering Society. He is in no mood to do this. So he ends up going to the lunch. The food not that great. He's not happy to be there. He's all impatient and everything. He's supposed to give up and get a speech. And now the engineers expected a speech kind of like this. Fair's going great. You guys are contributing. Thanks for all your help. Please continue to support. That's not what they got. They did not get a happy, feel good speech. What they got was Burnham getting up and going, you guys are supposed to be the best engineers in America, and you can't figure out something to like outdo Paris and the Eiffel Tower. Well, you're all horrible. And he just sat down. And they're all sitting there like, did he just insult us? I think he just insulted us. He insulted us. The architect's insulting us. Well, one of the engineers who was there was a young engineer from Pittsburgh named George Washington Ferris, who, as he was thinking more and more about it, was like, yeah, we really can come up with something. And so he kind of sketched out an idea that he had. It would be a two giant frameworks, like A frames, supporting a 200-foot diameter wheel where you would have seats and it would turn in a circle. Yes, George Washington Ferris proposed the idea of what was known as his giant wheel, the Ferris wheel, to Daniel Burnham. Burnham rejected it twice because he honestly thought that the wheel was going to pop off the A frames and it was going to roll down the midway, killing everybody in his path. But eventually, he got desperate enough. Now, let's conclude with a little bit of this. So, there wasn't a lot going on in Chicago in the around 1890 or something. Yeah, you could go see the Cubs play, but that was about it in the summer. And do all the other usual things, swimming in Lake Michigan and stuff if you didn't mind like poopy and things. One of the things that became fun to do was families would get on board their little carts and go down and have a picnic and watch the fair being built. And, young men and ladies, guys would take their girlfriends out. They would bike out to the fair site and watch what was going on. Well, one of the people who was out there one day was a Chicago pharmacist named Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Here's a picture of him. I love these hats, by the way. I would dearly love to have a derby. Those are called derbies or bowlers. They're super cool. Holmes was kind of an unusual character. He had arrived in Chicago in 1886, immediately fell in love with the city because it was so disgusting. It was chaotic and it was easy to get lost in. And he kind of liked that because he was a guy who was looking to get lost. He bought a pharmacy in Englewood and set up his store where he made tons of money because he was just everybody's friend. Women adored him. They could not get enough of him. He had some kind of magical power over the ladies, and men found him likable and charming and fascinating and just a great guy to hang out with. The problem is that Dr. Henry Howard Holmes didn't really exist. He was a made-up character named after his favorite literary character, Sherlock Holmes. In fact, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H. Holmes as he's more commonly known or remembered as, was actually a dude named Herman Webster Mudgett, born in Pennsylvania. He had a kind of a rough childhood with some weird tendencies. He went to school at the University of Michigan where he got a medical degree. He was a legitimate doctor. But instead of doing like medicine, he made his money off of stealing dead bodies and then selling them to medical schools and doctors for really high amounts of money because they desperately needed bodies to do practice work on. And being a real doctor, Mudgett could easily fake birth certificates and death certificates. So what he began doing was he would take out insurance policies on fake people. And then when he got a dead body, he would write out a death certificate for that dead person. bring it in, and being a doctor, the insurance company would pay him off on it. He made tens of thousands of dollars doing this. And because he could write his own birth certificate up to anytime he wanted to, because they didn't have any photo records back in those days, he pretended to be a variety of different people, changed his name frequently, and married more than one woman at the same time. And when he got tired or bored, he would move out. He would go away to somewhere else. He eventually got settled in Chicago. Now, what had occurred to him was that the fair would need some place for people to stay because it was going to mean hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people coming to Chicago. Holmes came up with an idea to sort of fit his bizarre hobbies. And he does have some bizarre hobbies. He bought an entire block of downtown Inglewood, which is a suburb of Chicago. Basically, it's in Chicago, but um, and he built a hotel, a giant 3-story hotel. But it was a very specific hotel. It would be a hotel for young, single, attractive ladies between the ages of 18 and 30 who were in Chicago with no family, no connections, only to work. Because Mr. H. Holmes is actually America's first recorded serial killer. And his decision to build this hotel and the clients that he attracted changed the way that America's law enforcement would function forever. Police work was never the same after the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and the discovery of H. Holmes' murder castle. We'll talk more about this later. Peace and love.